Sorry about the delay, there were a few technical issues. Welcome to this first in a series of talks from the Yorkshire Museum. While we're closed over the winter, we will be reopening next spring, but while we're closed, we've got a series of talks looking a bit more closely at different aspects of our collection. This is the first one of those. I'm a curator here at the Yorkshire Museum, and I'm going to talk about the Middlesbrough Meteorite. If you do have any questions at any point, just put them in the comments, and we'll get to those when we can. So yes, the first thing that we want to talk about today is this object, which is the Middlesbrough Meteorite. So it is the oldest thing in your museum's trust collections. It's over 4.5 billion years old, and it's got a really, before we talk a little bit about why this itself is a really interesting object, I want to tell you a little bit about how it got to be from Middlesbrough to the collections in York. So if we move to these pictures over here, if you look at your screen, you should hopefully see some slightly better quality ones. These are fairly contemporaneous press images from the time, so it's quite nice. They're very historic pictures. So this is the 14th of March, 1881. So this is the railway line behind what is now Rosebery Park Hospital in Middlesbrough. So there was a little area called Pennyman Siding, which I don't think is there anymore. And these four chaps are working away, as you know, a normal day on the railway, and they heard a whooshing, a roaring noise overhead, and a thud about 15 yards away from them. So they wanted to go and find out what the noise was. So here we have the chaps when they discovered what the noise was. So you can see this tiny little black area here. This is actually a hole. So this chap here, H. Obram, we don't know his first name, it's just H, bravely reached into the hole and pulled out what we now know is the Middlesbrough Meteorite. They didn't know what it was at the time. They thought it could be a bit of industrial slag that had been thrown out from some blasting nearby. But this chap, Frank Henwood, he did have a suspicion that it was something really quite special. So they kept it safe for a week or so before sort of passing it on to someone we'll talk about in a second. But do you remember this little hole here? And Mr. Obram. So we do actually have a cast of the hole. So I'm not sure who took this, but this is a really unusual thing to have. So you can see it's about sort of a foot deep, like 30 centimetres deep, and it's sort of, it was described as being shaped like an animal burrow, as opposed to sort of normally when you might think of, you know, film representations of meteor strikes, they make these huge craters, but because it fell into railway ballast, it just went straight down and made quite a deep, narrow hole. So this is a really, really lovely thing to have. So when they retrieved the meteorite, they put it in front of, they eventually made it so in front of a chap called Alexander Herschel from the famous family of astronomers who was based in Newcastle. He got extremely excited about it, and he wrote to the Newcastle Chronicle, I think it is, basically the local paper, on the 30th of March 1881 to describe this amazing thing. So he's called it an aerolite, which is what we now know as a chondrite, but I'll talk about in a second. So yes, he was able to confirm that it was a meteorite and something really, really special that these guys had the privilege of seeing. So he recommended, at the time, the Yorkshire Museum in Middlesbrough only came about in about 1904, so they didn't have a museum in Middlesbrough at the time. And Herschel being based in Newcastle, he sort of said maybe it could go to Newcastle, but he ultimately sort of recommended it should go to the British Museum of Natural History, which is now the Natural History Museum in London. But because it fell on what they called at the time North Eastern Railway land, they had the ultimate say on where it went. So we've actually got a copy of the letter here in September 1881 from the Secretary of the North Eastern Railway Company to the Secretary of the Yorkshire Philosophical Society, who were the founders of the collections here at the Yorkshire Museum, and they ultimately decided to give it to the collections in York. I'm sure there were some more connections going on in the background there that we don't quite know about, but that's how it ended up to be in the collections of York rather than in Middlesbrough or in London, where they've got lots more meteorites. So the reason, so to talk about the meteorite itself a bit more now. So as I say, at the time, Herschel identified it as an aerolite. So we would now call this a chondrite. So it's a stony sort of meteorite as opposed to an iron sort of meteorite. And about 90% of the finds on Earth are this sort of stony type. So they're sort of roughly equivalent to the sort of rocks you might get on Earth, as opposed to some sort of really exotic sort of metallic composition. The shape of it is really interesting. So if you can sort of see, it's roughly conical, and it's got these grooves coming down the surface, which is due to the way that it fell as it was coming through the atmosphere. It didn't tumble, so it didn't. None of the rest of the surface is sort of melted in that way, so it's got this sort of dark, slightly shiny fusion crust on it. And if I sort of look at the underside, I suppose, you can actually see where this has been historically sliced. You can actually see the edge of the fusion crust there, which is where the material has been superheated as it's come through the Earth's atmosphere. So it's a really, really interesting thing, and the shape of it meant that someone from NASA came to scan the shape of it into their database in 2010 so that they would be able to recognise any sort of similar shaped object on the surface of Mars as meteorites. So that's a really, that's another reason why it's a really interesting specimen. So if I talk a little bit more, so this slicing here, we didn't do this, it's quite helpful because you can sort of see the interior of the meteorite. And actually, because as I say, we've got this, it's so rare, there's only about sort of between 7 and 10 meteorites known to fall, seen to fall on the Earth every year, and even fewer of those are actually recovered. So to have this whole record of these guys actually hearing the thing fall and picking it out of the hole and then having the meteorite here as opposed to it breaking up when it hit the Earth is actually really, really special. So this is where samples have been taken. So there's a piece in the Natural History Museum in London, there's a piece in the American Museum of Natural History in New York, there's a piece in the Field Museum in Chicago, and there's a piece in the Natural History Museum in Vienna. So how it works is that there's a sort of international database of meteorites, which is run out of, I think it's called the Meteoritical Bulletin, which is run out of America. So someone can correct me if I'm wrong. So they've got all the information about this. So they've got the weight, which is about 1.5 kilos. The composition, it's an L6 chondrite, should you be interested in such things. They've got the fine spot and everything else, and the actual physical samples are dotted around the place for people to study. So I think that's more or less everything I was going to say about this today. We'll have another look at the shape of it. So if anyone does have any questions, please.
Someone has asked, would the meteorite have been quite hot when the rail workers found it?
That's a really good question, yes. So Mr. Oberon, when he pulled it out of the hole, he reported it as new milk warm, which we wouldn't necessarily recognise today, but I guess people got their milk slightly more from the source in those days, in 1881. So yes, it was warm when it was actually found. So to have this anecdotal information to go with the physical specimen is really, really rare and really exciting.
No more questions?
Okay, well, the next talk in this series is in January, so online again. So if you would like to, so this is the oldest thing we have in our collections, and then we'll be moving through time. So the next thing will be quite a lot younger. It's about 120,000 years old, as opposed to 4.5 billion years old, which this is. So it's a bit of a leap in time. And then there'll be a couple more talks in the sequence as well after that. So, and as I say, the Yorkshire Museum will be reopening in the spring, so keep an eye on our social media and our website for dates and how you can get tickets then. So, thank you very much, everyone.